that that Baha'u'llah hasn't come to bring one more religion, but rather he's recast the very conception of religion as the principal force impelling the development of consciousness. And that sentence, I think, is an entry point to a fundamentally and radically new way of thinking about religion. Not just in the last few thousand years that we can record and have some sort of historical memory of religious thought as expressed in a prophet and in a book, but it enables us to think, I think, more radically about the phenomenon of religion and the phenomenon of revelation as it is unfolded throughout cosmic history and cosmic time. In particular, it invites us to think about the process of divine revelation as something which is continuous with the material world. Something as a process in which the Big Bang itself and physical evolution itself, the same evolution that Darwin talked about, which people, I think, erroneously think is contrary to religion and negates religion. But I think viewed within its proper perspective, this cosmic picture of progress in the physical and spiritual planes is all a part of the spiritual purpose of creation. And as Abdu'l-Baha says in Paris Talks, progress is the expression of spirit in the realm of matter. So if we look at the biggest possible picture of things, we see an evolution, a progress, we see a directionality to physical processes, somehow superimposed upon the chaos and the entropy. I mean, there's that piece as well, that left to their own devices, things tend to decay and things tend to resolve back into their primordial chaotic components. But superimposed upon this churning chaos of the universe is this golden thread of progress, of which on this planet has manifested itself through a succession of organisms from unicellular to the human, which collectively delineate an onward march and expansion of consciousness. The consciousness which we recognize in the human realm as being the power of the mind and this awareness of others and awareness of the universe. But the phenomenon, this spiritual reality, this phenomenon of consciousness is something which really begins in the mineral realm. We don't usually think of rocks as being conscious, and obviously they don't think or react or anything in the way we do, but there is a way in which the mineral kingdom is conscious, and that is that it obeys the laws of nature. Consciousness at its most fundamental level can be thought of as response to the laws of nature. I mean, it obeys. You drop a rock, it falls to the ground. And extrapolate from that forward to the consciousness of the vegetable realm and the animal realm and so forth. These represent successively expanding degrees of something, the purpose of which we haven't yet really talked about, because we're still really only talking about the arc of descent. Recalling Unit 7 from a couple of days ago, and anticipating where our endpoint is going to be. Abdu'l-Baha gives us the grand metaphor that kind of ties all these ideas together, and it's the metaphor of the circle. A circle which has some structure to it, a circle which is constantly in motion, which has, however, no beginning or end in time, whose motion is the motion of physical evolution, whose motion is also the motion of progress, in the sense that Abdu'l-Baha talks about progress in the spiritual realm, progress in the social realm, progress in the human realm. All of this is continuous, and it's all mapped by this idea of the circle of existence, comprised of two arcs, an arc of descent, an arc of ascent, a descending arc of materiality, a descending arc of materiality, and an ascending arc of spirituality. So this is sort of the grand picture of the cosmos that we have. And but when we look at the progress, when we look at the evolution along this circle of existence, it's not just continuous, but it sometimes is characterized by discontinuities. I mean, not in a mathematical sense, with zero time between one step and the next. These discontinuities can be centuries long, millennia long, millions of years long if you look in geological time. But if you zoom out enough, you see that there's a transition from one state to another. When we look at human history, as far as we've been able to reconstruct it based on very fragmentary evidence, humanity has gone through different transformations, different discontinuous leaps forward in its consciousness. We talked about one of them yesterday and referred to it as the axial age. So this is an existing term. You can Google it. You can read all about it. It's an idea that's been really fleshed out in an academic context and has, I think, a lot of evidence behind it, because this is this first axial age, which is about 200 to 800 BC, most broadly defined, has a lot of historical evidence behind it. One can imagine that there was an even earlier axial age, that perhaps the only echo of which remaining is the story of Adam and Eve. In that very first axial age, which we might say marks the birth of humanity. If the axial age we talked about yesterday was the transition from the infancy of the human race to its childhood, then this earlier axial age could be defined as the birth of humanity, the birth of that first awareness, and mankind's expulsion from the Garden of Eden with their coming into the knowledge of good and evil. That first dawning awareness of there being a moral sphere, of there being a right and a wrong, might be said to mark that very initial or an earlier axial age. Perhaps there were even earlier ones, associated with other landmarks in humanity's collective evolution. But the point of mentioning these different collective leaps forward is to suggest that humanity is currently in the process of a second axial age, in the process of transitioning through a second axial age, which, as with the first axial age, was several centuries long. The second axial age is also several centuries long. It represents, as Baha'is would say, the emergence of the human race into maturity, its passage through adolescence into maturity. And as we can all see, and as anyone can see by picking up a newspaper, we are in the middle of a very turbulent adolescent period in which forces of disintegration are battling forces of integration. There is a widespread rejection of authority of all kind. There is a rejection of truth of all kind. There's a sort of, and we could go into details of that, but I don't think it's necessary to sort of paint a picture. We all have a clear picture ahead of what's going on, not just in recent years, but in recent centuries. And this process of destabilization, this process of the disruption of previous ways of thinking, has been ongoing really since, we could say the Renaissance, the sparking of the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance in Italy might even be, if we wanted to pull the starting point a little bit farther back, we might say it really began there, this sort of new direction in civilization. It happened to take place in the West, but it spread throughout the world. It led to the scientific revolution, and we spent some time yesterday talking about the scientific revolution and the enlightenment that it gave rise to. And the enlightenment is Immanuel Kant, one of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, had a great summary of what enlightenment is. He wrote a short essay called "What is Enlightenment?" And he said, enlightenment is mankind's emergence from their self-imposed adolescence. So it's very interesting that Kant, latched on to the exact same metaphor that that is used in the Baha'i writings to describe this phase that we're going through. But Kant was writing in the late 1700s. He said, "What is enlightenment?" In his essay entitled "What is Enlightenment?" He says, "Enlightenment is humanity's emergence from their self-imposed immaturity, or their self-imposed tutelage, or their self-imposed adolescence." It's originally written in German, and it's translated slightly different ways depending on which translator you refer to. And so what happened during the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment that followed, as we talked about yesterday, was a wholesale rejection of all sorts of authorities that were in the past taken as absolute. And this is what happens during adolescence in the course of an individual human being as well. And so what we're seeing is the replication of a pattern at a higher level or a larger level of organization that we see at a smaller level of organization. Just as human beings pass through childhood and adolescence to maturity, and there's certain phases you can identify. As a child, you refer to your parents as absolute authority. As an adolescent, you reject that authority entirely, even if it makes sense. As an adult, you sort of return to the idea that some kind of authority is actually necessary. But your idea of authority is now transformed. You don't have the same relationship to authority as an adult that you did as a child. It's a relationship to authority which is informed by reason. It's informed by, and it's a relationship to authority which allows you or gives you let's say, the freedom or sometimes even the responsibility to break the rules or to go against authority. If in your adult assessment of things that authority is contrary to certain larger values. So one of the things that happens during the Enlightenment in the which really began in the late 1600s and can be said to have peaked in the early 1700s, but gave rise to, among other things, the United States Constitution, the French Revolution, and so forth in the political realm. But one of the things that gave rise to was a wholesale rejection of priestly authority and a turning away, an abandonment of traditional religion, of institutional religion. One of the great exponents and let's say, beacons of the Enlightenment during that time was Voltaire. And he wrote voluminously and acerbically against organized religion of all kinds. And he's sort of known as, and sort of thought of, history remembers him as someone who was almost more responsible than anyone else for the abandonment of the churches and movement which began in the late 1700s, and a turn towards a more secular perspective on life. But in the context of this cosmic perspective that we're charting out, this idea about enlightenment and this process of enlightenment, which began a few centuries, as ultimately having a spiritual purpose, as being a part of the spiritual coming of age of the human race. One question we can ask, and I think it's a very important question, is what Voltaire was doing anti-religious? I mean, in the true sense of religion. I mean, it's clear that he was eroding and chipping away at the foundations of the authority of the Catholic Church. But will future history remember him as a force against religion, or as a force for the spiritual maturation of the human race? Was he rejecting religion, or was he rejecting superstition? And when one looks at the writings of Voltaire, I think the answer is the latter, that he's rejecting, and rightfully so, the superstitions of the faith into which he was born. When you look also at his writings, you find that he was very much a believer in God, but not the God of the church, not the simplistic God that was taught to the people of that age, but what today is called a more deistic God, a God in his view which was beyond personality, which was beyond these limited categories into which it was put. Referring to Unit 4 also, I think, if you remember some of the quotations there, one of the quotations by Abdu'l-Baha says the divine essence is sanctified above personality. Personality is an attribute of the manifestation, not of the essence. So one might look back at what was happening during the Enlightenment as something that Baha'is could all sign on to. That this wholesale rejection of superstition. Unfortunately, what also sometimes happened was the baby went out with the bathwater. And what you ended up was a rejection of the whole concept of religion, the whole concept of spirituality, the idea of there being a two-story building with the material world and the spiritual world is one might say, the casualties of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. With the onward march of science came a corresponding doubt that this two-story way of constructing the world is the most correct way of looking at the world. And as a result, you have what we call scientific materialism, sort of a collapse of those two stories back to one story, sort of turning away from that insight of the first axial age, that there is an axis and that there is an upper and a lower, there is something beyond. And the rejection was, perhaps that rejection was justified. I mean, perhaps what was being rejected was a model which itself was incorrect. And we're going to dig more into the way in which that model might have been incorrect and a way that the Baha'i writings present differently. And I maybe just to anticipate it and to clarify what I'm suggesting here a little bit more. René Descartes in the late 1600s was a famous French philosopher who was, let's say, largely responsible for a lot of things. He was a genius in multiple dimensions, but one of the things he's most famous for, other than I think, therefore I am, was the idea and an elaboration of the idea of this two-story idea of reality, which is known as philosophical dualism. The idea that you have bodies, you have material, our material self, and then you have minds or spirits, which Descartes suggested are made of some non-material substance. You have a soul, which is some non-physical thing, and which immediately raises the question, well, how is the spirit related to the body? And he had a whole philosophy about this, and it had something to do with the pineal gland at the center of the brain, which, if you cut open, he practiced a little bit of amateur anatomy, I suppose. He cut open some cadavers. He sliced open the skulls. He saw the brains were in two hemispheres. Well, that's an interesting fact. Maybe one hemisphere has to do with the spiritual, processing the spiritual realities, and one hemisphere has to do with processing material realities. Kind of a logical conclusion to come to. And as Descartes cut deeper into the brain, he found that there was a piece of the brain which was not divided into two hemispheres. It's called the pineal gland. And he said, aha, I found the connecting point between the spiritual and the physical world. It's that part of the brain which is not divided into two hemispheres. So, we laugh at it now as, a bit ridiculous, but it was taken very seriously at the time, late 1600s, early 1700s. And that kind of thinking was pervasive, at the time. And it was almost taken as a given that this is how to understand the world. You've got a sort of separate set of spiritual substances of which the soul is one. And then you have these material substances. Now, one might think, well, hold on, isn't this what the Baha'i teaches? Isn't this what we read in the Baha'i writings? And we do read, I think one could pull out from the Baha'i writings all sorts of quotations that would tend to confirm this picture of reality. That there are physical things and there are spiritual things. And we can find easily confirmation of this position of philosophical dualism in the Baha'i writings. But if we dig a little bit further, we'll also find other statements that completely undermine that idea of philosophical dualism. And some of them we were looking at today. In various of the packets were some quotations that don't seem to sit comfortably with an idea of philosophical dualism. And what I'll be suggesting is that the Baha'i writings contain, largely implicitly, but in some places explicitly, a picture of ultimate reality which is not dualistic, which is ultimately monistic, which ultimately states that there is, in the end, only one reality, only one kind of reality. It's us who divide it up. And our division of reality into physical or material and spiritual things is a function and feature of our own perspective and not a feature of the things in themselves. We'll come to that, I think, a little bit more tomorrow. I don't want to get too off track there. But I want to return to the idea of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. And the important question that has to be asked by Baha'is as we navigate the world and as we decide, as we figure out how to present the Baha'i revelation to the world, one of the questions we have to sort of have settled is the Baha'i revelation a post-Enlightenment or pre-Enlightenment religion? Does it embrace the transformation of human consciousness that attended the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment? Or does it take that to have been some sort of false start or a move in the wrong direction, which has to be corrected by going back to the point we were before? That's a common thought, if not explicitly, then implicitly. The idea that for the last few centuries, civilization has gone off track. It was on track in some more correct way, and it has become more materialistic. It's become farther away from God. It's become, and in some ways, of course, it has. And just look at the world. But the idea is that the world has become more materialistic and farther away from God. But perhaps another way to look at it is this apparent departure from God is really more a departure from superstition. And it's more a departure of the adolescent who's shaking off the childish notions. And with those childish notions, certain useful and true things get temporarily rejected, but they get picked up later as an adult. And so what is the position of the Baha'i faith in regards to the Enlightenment? Do we look at Voltaire, for example, and say, oh, what a terrible man. He rejected religion, he rejected God, he rejected the church. If things had gone the way they should have, then Europe would have stayed, with its solemn belief in God, the way it was before. Is it rather the case that just as the adult cannot go back to the mentality of the child, we can't go back to pre-Enlightenment religion? We can't turn the clock back to a way of thinking about God, a way of worshiping, a way of understanding the phenomenon of religion that is like the way we thought about it prior to the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. The Enlightenment made it impossible to go back into that narrow cage of the mind. Now, if that's true, then the next question we have to ask is, well, then what do we believe? If it's not something which is just a re-expression of, say, medieval theology, or it's not just, a slight update of Islamic philosophy and Islamic mysticism, or some other feature of the Judeo-Christian Islamic heritage. If it's not that, then what is it? What does it look like? And here's where I think, this is where I think Shoghi Effendi might have been alluding to when he said the thinking world is caught up with these social principles. It is now to the deeper teachings that we need to appeal in order to present the Baha'i faith to the world today. What are those deeper teachings? Those deeper teachings are not the things that people already knew before. It's not things that you say and people will just nod their head and say, yeah, okay. And it's going to be things that people, oh wow, I hadn't thought of it that way before. It's things that will change people's orientation. It's a way of thinking about religion that reverses our collective orientation from thinking about religion in terms of the past, in terms of the highest degree of truth is to go back to the source, and to think more about truth as forward thinking. It's a 180-degree turn in human consciousness. Our closest encounter with truth lies in front of us. It doesn't lie behind us. But to make that shift in orientation requires us to think fundamentally different about the phenomenon of religion, the phenomenon of spirit, the phenomenon of revelation, and the phenomenon of religion. The four, let's say, pillars, the four, most fundamental concepts that define our religious worldview. All four of these have to be re-examined and potentially recast. But in the recasting, it's not that we're necessarily rejecting all of these past ideas as erroneous and throwing them in the dustbin and adopting an entirely new set of ideas. It's actually not as simple as that. Just as an adult is capable of understanding multiple perspectives and the relative truth of different perspectives. And I think that's what we're also going to have to do. It's not a matter of looking at old concepts of God and saying, well, this is the wrong way of thinking about God. Here's a new right way of thinking about God. There's always going to be a diverse means of approach to the divine. There will always be people who think about God in ways that we might say, like, sociologically, are medieval or are traditional. And there are others who will always think about God in less personal terms, in more deistic terms, in more diffuse terms. It's not that there are going to be warring camps and one of them is going to win. It's not that there's only one right way to think about this. And that was the purpose of, I can't remember the unit number. It was unit 2, which talks about there being different perspectives. In several different occasions, Baha'u'llah was directly asked a question where you might think here's where he's going to be forced to give an answer, either this or that. How does God relate to the world? Pantheism, deism, theism, atheism. Those are essentially the four schools of thought that Manachi Sahib was asking Baha'u'llah. You think, here's Baha'u'llah's chance to clear the air once and for all and say, this is the right way of thinking about God and God's relationship to the world. That's not what Baha'u'llah did. You might think, well, theism is the way to go, right? That's the narrative that we're all familiar with. That's what we teach in our children's classes. That's what's in our Ruhi books. That's how, all of our introductory material is focused around this. If there's one thing that you might say we can say about the Baha'i faith, it's this robust theism, monotheism. But here, Baha'u'llah is being asked a question about three different theologies beyond the theistic, monotheistic theology, and Baha'u'llah doesn't take that opportunity to say, yeah, those are wrong and this one is right. He instead says, and his original answer is in the first tablet to Manachi Sahib, and I think everyone has heard this.
That he said it was complete.
Yeah, and he said, and this was the complete answer, and you've probably all heard it before. Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the day in which you live, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements. That was his answer to this theological question about four schools of thought. Don't worry about the theology. It's all about the needs of the day. What the theology is a function of the needs of the day. Baha'u'llah doesn't and never tells us, and never leads us to the idea of telling us that what he's giving is some sort of absolute truth. It's a relative truth. It is a remedy for the illness of the age, and the divine physician has his finger upon the pulse of humanity, perceives the illness and prescribes in his infallible wisdom the remedy which the present age may require is never the same as that which a previous or subsequent. I'm paraphrasing. You know the quote. And then he says, "Be anxiously concerned with the needs." So that's such a key paragraph there that encapsulates so much of the religious revolution that Baha'u'llah has brought. A revolution in thinking about religion, which is different from thinking about religion as a neat, tidy package of truth that everyone has to sign onto in the same way. A catechism, the Nicene Creed, something that everyone understands in the same way, and that's what binds a community together. That's not what it is in Baha'u'llah's conception of religion. There will always be different takes on the truth. The 7 values is a perfect example of this. This isn't just, 6 degrees of error and 1 degree of truth. The 7 values represent different approaches from different seekers And each valley is true and correct in its own station. That was also a point that was made in section 2. So one has to be able to understand that truth is relative. Religious truth is relative. Even the truth that Baha'u'llah brought is relative. Which means that the community can no longer define itself by adherence to a common catechism or to a common creed, a common dogma. The Baha'i faith is free from dogma in that sense. Not that there aren't vast amounts of teachings and wisdom that Baha'u'llah brought, but that what defines us as Baha'is is not that we all sign on to, in the exact same way, a laundry list of dogmas. We're united by something else. We're united by our action in the world, by our orientation in the world of service to humanity and service to, as the House of Justice puts it, this evolving consciousness which Baha'u'llah's redefined religion to be. It's an in-the-world point of unity, rather than a point of unity in some ultimately unattainable theological realm that there's always going to be discussion and conflict and disagreement about. So Baha'u'llah has shifted the point of unity to something which is actually tangible and realizable. So this is this way of thinking about religion is, we can say, inspired by the scientific revolution. Because one thing that happened, an amazing thing that happened in the scientific revolution, and this represents, I think, one of the more subtle leaps forward in consciousness that this shift in our approach to truth led to, was a realization that even in science, the absolute truth is not attainable. Now, it may be that there's a culture of science which says that science is the absolute truth, the reference point for everything else. Once you have the equation, that's the truth. That's actually not the case. Equations may get you 99.99% of the way to the truth. But in that 0.01% lies a complete revelation in the way and revolution in the way you think about the world. Let me give an example. Prior to the scientific revolution, a lot of people believed the Earth was flat. We can laugh at that now because it's so obviously wrong. But in reality, believing that the Earth is flat is an excellent approximation to reality. And unless you're getting on an airplane and flying around the world, and there weren't any airplanes a few hundred years ago, or unless you're getting on a boat and sailing around the world, and even prior to a few hundred years ago, there weren't even those, prior to, say, Magellan, people could be forgiven for living their lives according to the excellent approximation that the Earth is flat. Now, we know that the Earth isn't flat. We know that the Earth is round. But the difference between a flat Earth and a round Earth to a pre-technological society is a matter of metaphysics. It's a matter that opinions will differ on. Until you get to the point of pushing your material progress where it really matters, this sort of difference between a flat Earth and a round Earth is not a difference that really has any cash value in the world. It's not a difference that's going to make that a life or death sort of difference. Let's go to the next level of approximation, and this came with Isaac Newton, who brilliantly deduced from some data that had been collected about the motion of the stars, the motion of the planets around the sun, the motion of projectiles on the Earth. Isaac Newton discovered the universal law of gravitation, which can very simply be written in a beautifully compact equation, which anyone who's taken an engineering class or physics class knows. G-m-m over r squared, there's a minus sign in the front. That defines the force between any two objects. So there's a constant involved, there's a couple of masses involved, and there's a square of the distance involved. That little package, that little, bit of truth, not absolute truth, that little bit of reality is enough to send satellites in orbit around the Earth. It's enough to send spaceships to the moon. It's like so incredibly accurate, to how many decimal points that it gets you quite a long ways. The problem is, it's wrong. I mean, it's right to to the nth degree. But within that tiny fraction of a degree where it's wrong, it is so wrong. It is so completely wrong. And that fraction of a degree wasn't even available. There were a couple of hints that maybe Newton's laws were wrong. People who took Newton's laws and said, okay, let's plot out all the orbits of the planets now. Got these beautiful, totally accurate results, except for the orbit of Mercury. Orbit of Mercury was a bit of a problem because it's the closest planet to the sun, the fastest moving planet. One could project, knowing its radius and its period and so forth, what it's, one could project what the period of the orbit of Mercury ought to be, given the radius of the planet, according to Kepler's laws. The problem is the period was just a little bit off. I mean, a tiny bit off. I mean, if there are 360 degrees in a circle, we're talking about a fraction of 1 degree, a very small fraction of 1 degree, that the orbit of Mercury was off. And the scientists of the day thought, well, maybe our observations are a bit off. Like, that's your natural thing. How could Newton's laws be wrong? Because they're so perfect and they get us so far. But it turned out that little bit of what's technically called the precession in the perihelion of the orbit of Mercury, that little observation was a wedge opening onto a completely different view of the world. And that completely different view of the world was, I'm not going to say perfectly explained, but was explained to the limit of our observation by Einstein's general theory of relativity, which posited a completely different view of time and space. It's like a fabric. It's like a warped fabric. And the warpage of that fabric is due to mass energy concentrations, of which the sun is the most notable example in our local universe. And the sun warps space and time just enough to cause this precession in the orbit of Mercury. And one of the great sort of resounding triumphs of Einstein's theory of general relativity was when the equations were used to correctly predict the exact amount of that precession of the perihelion, thus reconciling the theory with the reality. There was another, I mean, we don't have time to go into all of the fun details of this, but there was a second sort of bit of observational evidence that proved the accuracy of Einstein's theory of general relativity in the bending of light around the sun from distant stars. Normally you can't see any stars in the vicinity of the sun, but with special instrumentation, if you block out the sun with a special filter, you can make out, stars behind the sun, just beyond the disk of the sun. And according to general relativity, the starlight itself will bend just a little bit as it goes around the sun. And that slight bending in starlight means that a star that's right at the edge of at the limb of the sun, the very edge of the sun, will seem to be spread out a little bit farther from the edge of the sun than it really is. And you know how far it ought to be, because when it's not near the sun, you can measure the positions of the stars extremely precisely. But when it's near the sun, that star that ought to be like right at the edge of the sun seems to be pulled out a little bit. And there's no explanation for that within the realm of Newton's laws. It requires this leap forward in understanding of the physical world, which is provided by Einstein's theory of general relativity. But, as close as that is to reality, we know that Einstein's theory of general relativity cannot be the final theory, because it is incompatible with quantum mechanics and this other great branch of physics, of the physics of very small particles and the behavior of matter in the quantum realm. There is a deep inconsistency between the laws of physics as described by Einstein's equations and the laws of physics as described by quantum mechanics. Nobody yet knows how to get around this. This is, the holy grail of theoretical physics today. There are a few very, very interesting proposals for how to reconcile the two. The most popular and fashionable of which is called string theory, which says ultimately that the fundamental constituents of matter are not point particles as initially proposed by Democritus, like 400 BC, and confirmed by experiments subsequently, but rather that the fundamental constituents of matter are one-dimensional strings, either closed loops that are vibrating or open loops, just of such a small diameter or extent that they seem like point particles to us. A lot of problems are resolved by thinking that ultimately reality is not, fundamental reality is not zero-dimensional, but one-dimensional. That's the sort of sum, that's kind of the one phrase summary of what string theory is. It says reality is not, the constituents of reality are not zero-dimensional like a point, but one-dimensional like a string. It beautifully solves the problem of the inconsistency between general relativity and quantum mechanics, but it raises other problems that have not yet been solved. And one of the problems is it seems to multiply to infinity the number of universes, which is taken by some to be a problem. It's taken by others as an opportunity. Maybe the universe really is a multiverse of infinite extent, not just spatially, but infinite extent in terms of the variety of the laws that govern it and the variety of the physical constants and so forth. So all of this has a point. All of this sort of science, these insights from science, and from this sort of brief sketch of our understanding of the world and gravity from flat Earth to string theory and beyond. What's the point? The point is that we never have access to ultimate reality, or we never know whether we've accessed ultimate reality. We never know when we've come to the end. All we can say is that we have better and better maps. Science is a map-making activity. And the maps, certain kinds of maps, may be extremely useful to accomplish certain sorts of goals, even though we know that the maps are inaccurate in certain places. And that's okay, given the sort of goal that we want to accomplish. So we know that Newton's laws are an inaccurate map of ultimate reality, but most of the time we don't care. Most of the time it's okay to use g(m) over r squared. If you want to build a house, you don't even need that. But if you want to do your rocketry or whatever, if you want to build your ballistic missiles, if you want whatever you want to do in the world, that's the only equation you need to worry about. But you know that it's an inaccurate map. And we have these sorts of examples all over in the world. Who's ridden the London subway or the New York subway? So everyone at some point has gone down to the subway station and looked at the subway map. And the subway map is full of these angular lines, and none of the lines actually trace the line of the subway, and none of the subway stops are actually the correct distance from each other. It's a totally warped fabric, these subway maps. But man, are they useful. They get you from point A to point B in the fastest time, possible, and with the least amount of confusion. But everyone knows these subway maps are a distorted fabric. They don't. But we're okay with that. We know when we go above ground, reality is going to be different from the map that we're using to get from point A to point B. So just as physics or science is this successive map-making activity, we can also think of religion as approximative maps of the spiritual domain, maps that get us from point A to point B. They help guide us morally, ethically in the world. They tell us, okay, you're at this station. I have these two options. What's the right option? Religion and the approximations of religion enable you to get to your destination with the least amount of fuss and bother and trauma, hopefully. Yes?
You open so many people astounding. Go through this, and what would we find over there? You go, what would happen over there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, okay, so if if religion then is fundamentally a map-making activity, and ultimately the part of what makes it, in the case of science, what makes these maps approximative is the fact that the equations we're using are approximate equations. And in the case of the material world, in the case of science, it's the language of mathematics that describes the operations of nature. In the case of most of human life, it's human language that we use to navigate our way through the world. And just as the mathematics of science are only give us approximate solutions to reality, the grammar of language only gives us approximate solutions to ultimate reality, only guides us in an approximate way to the ultimate realities that lie underneath the surface. Remembering our exercise in the racism class from the first day, where you have these sticky notes, you stick them on a sign. You can think of language as being these sticky notes that we stick upon what we take to be some underlying reality. And there are, of course, for every different language, there's a different sticky note. And not all languages map one-to-one onto the same underlying objects. For simple ones, yes, house, dog, mother, father, okay, there's some basic ones where there's really no ambiguity, but when you get to the ones that really matter, there's a lot of ambiguity. The ones that matter morally. To take an example, one that where a nuance is lost, there's the word justice in the Baha'i writings is that there's more than one word in the original language that gets translated as justice. There's adl and there's ensaf. In the second hidden word, the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. That's a different word than universal house of justice. And these two words have different connotations in the original language. It's lost in translation into English. The connotation in the word is more fair-mindedness. And that word ensaf is actually translated by Shoghi Effendi elsewhere as fair-mindedness. So the idea of the relationship between words and reality, the point is not always the same from language to language. Some languages simply are more impoverished in describing certain dimensions of reality. Other languages have a superabundance of words. English has a superabundance of words about certain metaphysical realities because it's glommed, vacuumed up words from a variety of other languages. It has a lot of Germanic words, which are, let's say, a lot of the core vocabulary. It also has a lot of Latinate words that came in from William the Conqueror in 1066 and all the centuries of French domination of the island that followed. And so a lot of Latin word vocabulary enters into English. It has a bunch of other words, from Scandinavian to you name it. Words enter into English, some Greek. And so what that means is that certain words, substance, reality, essence, soul, spirit, mind, heart, the language can lead us, perhaps erroneously, to thinking that there are individual realities behind each of these labels. Not necessarily the case. And the quotes from Unit 1 were supposed to suggest that, especially that one from T.T. Suzuki, about this bad habit that we have of connecting, of assuming that there's this sort of fixed reality behind every word. Not necessarily the case. And there are multiple dimensions to this. Maybe that there's different languages that have different words that enter into another language that causes this confusion. It could be that certain realities have multiple words in the native dialect. It could be that one word can be used to refer to multiple other realities. It could be that the reality itself is not a static thing, but as our understanding of the world evolves, that reality also evolves. But then the word sort of carries along with it, until there's stress and there's confusion arises because of under the evolution of human consciousness and not always tracking the evolution of language. I think that's one of the points implicitly that the Bab makes. in his use of language, his incredibly innovative use of language, when he actually bends and sometimes breaks the limits of grammar in order to make a larger point. And the point doesn't have anything to do with something that could be constructed grammatically. And as a result, Bob was sometimes falsely accused of not writing proper Arabic or not writing proper English, because you look at it and you kind of, it's hard to piece together according to the rules of grammar what he's saying. But when you understand that the words are just arbitrary signifiers of deeper reality, one can start thinking about revelation in different terms. That maybe it's something that's, okay, it's using grammar, it's using words, but maybe it's more like poetry, or maybe it's more like music. That prayer, you might have heard in the Arabic prayer that I read this morning, there's a sort of cadence to it. There's a repeated phrase that gives, and the repetition doesn't add extra meaning grammatically to the prayer, but the repetition adds a dimension, it adds a beat, it adds a rhythm to it, which is itself part of the meaning of the prayer. And that's one of the ways in which music and art can be so profoundly more expressive than language and its limited grammar, or mathematics and its limited grammar, which is the grammar of the natural world. We have multiple languages available to us and multiple grammars. And the grammar and language of revelation only partly maps onto the logic of the grammar and vocabulary of everyday speech. And part of that, I think, the mistake of interpreting Revelation is to think of Revelation as everyday speech and to try to interpret the words and the grammar as though it's just everyday speech. Very easy to make that mistake because it's written in words and letters, and sometimes maybe it is meant to be read just as written. For instance, when Baha'i reveals the law of the Kitabi Akdas, okay, that's what he meant. But so often it's the case that the thing that's being conveyed, the thing that he's trying to offer to us, the words are only imperfect indicators of. And really there's a song, or there's a note, or there's a something underneath which vibrates, which has its own frequency, which has a resonance that can resonate with the innate frequencies of the human heart or the human soul. But to catch that resonance requires one to be in a different sort of frame of mind than the usual sort of discursive, sort of logical mind that we use when we read normal words.
So why did he do it that way?
So why would he do it that way? For the same reason that Christ spoke in parables. I mean, it's the same sort of logic, And he said, why do I speak in... And Christ would say over and over, he that hath an ear, let him hear. Gives a parable. He that hath an ear, let him hear. People who are just listening to the external words won't necessarily catch the spiritual meaning behind it. The spiritual meaning which is meant for those who have the ear to hear. The revelation is meant to lift humanity to the next level of consciousness. It's meant as a catalyst to propel human evolution forward along the arc of ascent. And for that reason, their writing and the language of the revelation is a language appropriate to that next level that they're trying to draw us to. And if we read through the eyes of the previous level, it can be incoherent to us. It can just sound like it doesn't make sense to us. But when you see it with that eye, which is sometimes called the eye of faith, or the spirit of faith in the Baha'i writings, which is as distinct from the human spirit as the human spirit is from the animal spirit. If we think of the degrees of spirit as occupying different stages along the arc of descent, from the mineral to the vegetable to the animal to the human, then the next degree in that arc is the spirit of faith. And again, it is as distinct from the human, from the perception of the human realm, as the perception of the human realm is from that of the animal. And the language of revelation has a resonance in that realm of consciousness that it doesn't have in the sort of everyday realm of logical thinking. Are we running out of time? Oh my gosh.
2 minutes.
We have 2 minutes. Oh my gosh. How are we going to do this?
Now we have 1 minute.
Time's a wasted. Okay, because I still have a huge amount, but we have tomorrow. Okay, so I'll just sort of finish with an invitation to thinking, to briefly coming back to the idea of scientific revolution and enlightenment and the second axial age, and the Baha'i faith as representing, as being continuous with the Enlightenment, and not something which is fundamentally rejecting the insights of the Enlightenment. It's embracing science. It's embracing reason. It's embracing the idea, as we read in Unit 5, that religion consists in the essential relationships that proceed from the realities of things. It's a ground-up phenomenon. We can think of it as top-down, but maybe that's a Newtonian approximation. In another way, it's a ground-up phenomenon. Maybe that's the sort of the general relativity way of thinking about it. It's a little bit more subtle. Either way can serve us, but a deeper way of understanding it is as a ground-up phenomenon. And we'll be looking tomorrow and trying to pull together more pieces of how the Baha'i writings embody revolutionary perspectives in these 4 areas that I mentioned: God, spirit, religion, and revelation. So, continue on.